Hello, I'm Leonard Maltin. Star Wars may have started out as a mere movie, but it became a phenomenon. It changed the way movies were made and perceived and marketed. It ushered in a new era of science fiction and fantasy and developed a whole new vocabulary of visual special effects. And the man who created the film, who imagined it and then realized it, is here with us today to share some of his memories. George Lucas. George, if I asked you to sum up your feelings today, looking back at the whole Star Wars experience, if I asked you to sum that up in one word, what word first comes to mind?
If there's anything the Star Wars experience has been for me, it's unpredictable. You know, not only in the making of the movies and in creating the stories in the first place, which is the fun of it, is because you don't know where it's going to go, and the making of them were a huge adventure. But the success and all the stuff that's come after it and everything is just, you have no idea what's going to happen next.
Let's go all the way back to the beginning. What was the beginning?
I would say probably the original impetus for the whole thing was, I used to watch a serial on television called Adventure Theater, and they had Flash Gordon Conquers the Universe on it, and I used to love that. So I went off and wrote my own space opera and developed the story and took it to United Artists that had the first rights to it. They said no, they didn't want it, and then I took it to Universal because I just finished American Graffiti, and they said no, they didn't want it. And finally took it to 20th Century Fox, and Alan Knight Jr. said, I'm interested. He said, I don't understand this, but I loved American Graffiti, and whatever you do is okay with me, because otherwise I don't think it would have ever gotten done, because it was crazy. You know, spaceships and Wookiees and robots, and it was just unlike anything that had ever been seen before.
Tell me about that first script. Now, did you try to tell the whole story in one script?
Well, at that point, it wasn't the whole story. I wrote a script, and the script was very ambitious. It told a very large story. And when I finished it, I realized that it was way too big to make into a movie. So I took the first part of it, sort of the first act, and I said, I'll make the movie about this. And I had to expand on it and move it around, play with it a little bit. But I basically then focused on that as being the film. And I said, someday, if I ever get a chance, maybe I'll make these other things, the rest of it, the other two-thirds, into a movie. But right now, that's just going to have to go on the shelf, and I'll leave it there. And so that's really how the first project came to pass. The other part of it is in order to write that first script, I had to write a backstory about where Darth Vader came from, how the kids evolved, his wife, how Ben related to all that, how the Emperor came to power. And that ended up being the basis for the projects that I'm working on now.
You have a go-ahead on the script. You're revising it as you're preparing now to shoot the movie. How do you begin to prepare to shoot this movie?
I went around and there were no departments at the studios, no one to do this. So I had to sort of build up from scratch my own special effects company in the process of starting this whole thing.
How do you find people? How do you find the right people to do that kind of thing and to invent things, which is what they had to do?
Yeah, there was a small group of people that had done special effects. Some guys who worked in commercials doing the Pillsbury Doughboy and this, so there was maybe a few dozen people in Hollywood that actually had some experience. They were mostly college students. They're mostly very young. I think the average age of ILM when it started was like 24. That's the average age, and so there are a lot of kids that were like 19, 20 years old.
Tell me about some of the casting decisions.
What I would do is I would take the various contenders for the various roles and I'd mix them around and have them work ensemble. Because what I was trying to do is see how they all look together and work together as a group, not as individuals. And I think that was a very important part about the casting is that I cast a group. I didn't cast one person, one person, one person. I saw how they all worked together and then chose it that way.
What was the most serendipitous bit of casting?
Probably Harrison. Fred Roos, who was helping with my casting, was a good friend of Harrison's, and so he had him. He was a carpenter, and he sort of had him. I mean, he'd been an actor and he'd been under contract, but he was working as a carpenter, fixing their offices up. And as I was casting everybody, we said, well, we'll start doing these tests. And I said, well, we're short one Han Solo. I've only found 4, and I need 5 because I have 5 of everything else. And so I just said, well, Harrison, do you want to do this? You want to stand and sort of read some parts against these other parts so we can get through this thing? And he said, yeah, and he started reading them. He read them better than anybody else did.
What was the toughest part of making Star Wars?
Well, there was a lot of drama through the whole thing. It was a very tough film to make. It was a fairly low-budget film. It was a $10 million movie at a time when most movies the big-time movies were $20, $30 million.
How much of that went to effects?
Well, $2 million went to effects. There weren't very many effects. And I think the toughest part was when I finished shooting, I came back to the United States, I had no editor, I had to reassemble the entire movie of what had been cut, start from scratch. I went down to ILM, and they'd spent $1 million out of the $2 million. We were about 5 months away from release of the movie, and they didn't have any shots done. And I was panicked because I had nothing. I had no movie, I had no effects. I had a big mess on my hands.
When did you know it was working, that it was turning into a phenomenon with the public?
It was, it wasn't really until it came out and it was in the theaters. I was still, even the day it came out, and Laddie called me and said, it's a hit, the first 3 performances sold out, it's going to be giant. I said, look, all science fiction films do well in the first week. Wait until the 3rd week, and then let's see what happens. So I was always the pessimist.
I'm sure you know how much Star Wars means to so many, many people around the world. We all appreciate you sharing your memories with us today, George. Hello, I'm Leonard Maltin. When you've made a film that is not only extraordinarily successful, but has embedded itself in our popular culture, well, that's a tough act to follow. But George Lucas managed to pull it off. After Star Wars came The Empire Strikes Back. A totally successful film in its own right, as well as one of the most popular sequels ever made. And he's here today to tell us a little about the genesis of that film and its place in the Star Wars trilogy. Thanks for being here, George.
Thank you.
Star Wars has come out. A success, I think it's fair to say, beyond your expectations.
Yeah, definitely.
At what point did you receive a commitment or an urging to do a sequel? And did you immediately say yes, or was there any hesitation on your part to do it?
Well, it didn't really happen that way, because what I did when I was writing it, I wrote one movie, and then I couldn't do the whole movie because it was way too big. The first draft was, it had too much stuff in it. It was way too big. It couldn't possibly be done. So I took a deep breath and said, okay, I'm going to have to take all these great ideas, and that part I'm just going to have to cut out. And I'll just do what it was then really the first act, and I'll expand this and make this into a movie. So I did that, but then as a writer, you create this whole thing, and it's, sitting there on the shelf. So as soon as the film was successful, there wasn't any question in my mind that I would immediately go on and do the rest of them so I could finish it.
What to you is the biggest difference, overall difference, between film number 1 and film number 2?
Well, the biggest problem I was grappling with in film number 2 is the fact that it's the middle act of a 3-act play.
Now, some people find it a darker film than the first.
It is a darker film because in the first act you introduce everybody. The second act you put them in the worst possible position they can ever get into in their lives, and it's and they're in a black hole, never able to get out. And in the third act they get out. That's just, again, that's drama. That's the way it works. You don't have an exuberant, happy second act.
What was the biggest technological advance between the making of 1 and the making of 2?
Well, there wasn't really too much of a technological. We refined what we had primarily, but there wasn't any giant The major technological break was in 1, and that was using motion control cameras and that sort of thing to allow the ships to be able to move freely and that sort of thing. That was the big advance. Everything after that was we were able to do more stop motion. I was able to do a lot more things. They weren't really technological advances, but I was able to get a lot more into stop motion, which I couldn't do before, and generally have a bigger scope to things than I could do before. So, if the first film was a technological challenge to get ships to fly in space with a lot of that movement, the second one was to do a stop motion movie.
How did you choose or get together with Frank Oz to be Yoda?
When I created Yoda, I said I want him to be really, really small, but not 6 feet. I want him to be about 18 inches, 2 feet high. And to do that, I said, well, what am I going to do, and how am I going to get a character, and what am I going to do? Whenever I'm creating one of these films, I mean, I have my imagination, and if I were a novelist, I could just write it, and I wouldn't have to think about it. But I write it, and then I say, well, now how am I going to do this? How am I going to pull this off? And I decided to do it as a puppet. I thought that was the best. And so I'd known Jim Henson, and I went to Jim and said, do you want to do this? Because I really asked Jim to do it first, and he said, well, I'm busy, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, and I'm making a movie and all, and I really can't, but how about, Frank? Frank's the other half of me and everything. And I said, well, that would be fantastic.
It's an extraordinary creation.
I think it was exciting for everybody because it was the idea of taking, and Jim was very interested in doing realistic characters, that weren't really Muppets, and so we all really worked together on it.
Tell me about how you first met and worked with John Williams.
I had known Steven Spielberg for a long time up to this point, and we were talking about the film real early on when I was writing the script, and I said, I want a classical score. I want the corn gold kind of feel about this thing. It's an old-fashioned kind of movie, and I want that grand soundtrack that you used to have on movies. And he said, the guy you got to talk to is John Williams. He did Jaws. I love him. He's the greatest composer ever lived. You got to talk to him. And so I did. It was really Steven that introduced us and recommended him. And I talked to him and said okay, and he said he was interested. So he did it, and he's a dream to work with. He's a most wonderful collaborator.
Didn't you at first want him to use existing classical music? Is that true?
No. I had written it to certain pieces of music. I write to music. So when I'm writing a scene, I have the music there, and I'm writing it to the music. And then in a lot of cases, we'll use that same music as a temp track. So there was temp tracks of classical music in the score. And with Johnny, you can say, look, I want something that feels exactly like this. You understand the emotion here and the emotion there and what's going on. He said, yeah. And then he will take that and he will come up with his own composition and his own themes, which are uniquely, Star Wars themes in this case. But he'll give it that same emotional thrust that was in the classical piece. He knows exactly what I'm talking about, and he's really conscientious in trying to get the director's vision on the screen.
What kind of feedback did you get to that incredible climactic scene in Empire when we all learn who Darth Vader really is?
I was nervous about it, but in the end I didn't get much of a reaction out of it. I mean, people were curious about whether it was true or not, and I purposely left it so that it would be ambiguous, so that you wouldn't really know, and people would sort of debate it for the next week. Again, I had 2 more years or more to. I wanted people to sort of debate whether it's true or not true, or like sort of thing.
Well, George, as you know, people are just nuts for these movies, and to learn so much about them and what went into them and what inspired you is a real treat.
No, thank you. It's fun. I hope that people continue to enjoy the films because it's nice to think of them as being timeless.
Hello, I'm Leonard Maltin. In the old days of those Saturday matinee cliffhanger serials, the audience had to wait an entire week to find out what happened to its hero. George Lucas went well beyond that. He kept us all waiting years between Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back, and then finally, The Return of the Jedi. Thanks for being here, George. By the time you got to episode 3, did anything from public feedback or from your own second thoughts change your vision of what the third installment should be? Or is it the way you thought it always would turn out?
No, it's pretty much the way it was always thought to come out. I mean, I had to make certain changes to things because in the original screenplay, the Ewoks were Wookiees, and Chewbacca really wasn't the co-pilot. So, and so when I did the first film, I loved the Wookiee so much, I said, well, I got to get a Wookiee in here, even though, because those may never get done. So I took the Wookiee out of the battles and made him the co-pilot. because originally they were sort of a primitive race of people who couldn't fly or couldn't do anything, and because that was the whole point. And so I had to figure out how I was going to do Wookiees, and I basically cut them in half and called them Ewoks. But it was a lot of that stuff is all there. But in the original, it was a ground battle and an air battle all together.
How did you ever think of Jabba the Hutt?
Well, Jabba, it's one of those things. I needed a gangster. I mean, he was in the first film, and in the in the special edition, we're putting back a lot of material with Jabba the Hutt in the first film, in the very first one that we did, and he was in that. He was this big gangster, and it wasn't until a little later that we actually, because we couldn't do that sequence because we didn't have the time, but. When we got to the third one and Jabba appeared, then we did this whole thing of designing that one as a big kind of repulsive character, and we had a lot of designers coming up with various versions of Jabba the Hutt.
Was it a conscious decision to move a good chunk of the action for Part 3 into an earthly outdoor terrain? It's so different from anything you see in the first two films.
Well, it was. I'm very conscious of the environments. And I try to have at least 3 environments in a movie, and I try to have them as different as possible. And then from movie to movie, I try to have the environments as different as possible. In the first movie, we were on a sand thing. It was all kind of a brown color. And so then on the second one, I put in the snow, and it was all kind of white. And then I did the green, swampy kind of thing. And the third one, what can you do in terms of environments? You have to shoot it somewhere on this earth. Unfortunately, we can't go somewhere else. So, a forest was really about the only thing I had left. And originally, even with the Wookiees, the Wookiees lived in a forest environment. They lived in the same kind of tree houses, and they did that. They were sort of Earth people. There's a whole motif of like Luke's planet. Everybody is brown. There's lots of browns and earth tones. Everything is earth tones and light tan and light brown, flesh color. It's all very warm tones. And then when you go to the Death Star, it's all black and white. Everything is black and white all the time. I mean, it's all very harsh and contrasty in black and white. And I use that a lot. And so in the large arc, it was the same way. It was, where the Wookiees lived, it was all sort of green and brown. I added that in. It sort of was a motif that went from sort of a tan brown to a green brown. And so that sort of still exists in the actual film. There's a whole color and environment motif that goes through, and the good guys are all the earth colors, and the bad guys are all colorless.
Your many, many fans, and there are many avid fans, as you know, of the Star Wars trilogy, are wondering about the next 3 films, and why is it taking so long? Why does it take so long, and how long will it take?
Well, I'm working on the next 3 films, and I am in the process of writing the 3 screenplays now, and it takes a while to write the screenplays. To write the first Star Wars took me about 2 years, so I'm writing 3 scripts at once. It won't take that long, but it takes a long time to prep them, and hopefully we'll have one finished for 98. If not, it'll be 99. But we're doing all 3 at once. I'm writing all 3 at once, and the first 3 are based on the backstory that relates to where everybody came from, how they got there, what their relationships are.
Has this backstory been in your head all along from the inception? Or?
Yeah. I mean, I had to do the backstory in order to write the first 3. I had to know where Darth Vader came from. I had to know what his relationship to Luke was. I had to know how Ben Kenobi figured in all of this. And I had to realize that I had to understand that there were twins, and the whole arc of the story in the 3 that are out there now is really the redemption of Anakin Skywalker. And so the first 3 are really, that I'm writing now, are really about Anakin Skywalker. So now you have a redemption of somebody that you don't really even know. He's just always in a black suit. But you don't know how he fell from grace and the trauma that went through to get him to there, and then his son brings him back. But it's, and the real story hasn't even been told yet.
What would it take to persuade you to go back onto a soundstage and direct a film yourself?
Well, I'd like to direct again. I mean, I'm very interested and still in directing, and there is a possibility I may direct one of the next Star Wars. If I do direct again, it'll be the first one, so that I can set the stage and and how everything works for the other directors to follow.
But as we approach the millennium, we can look forward to the prequel trilogy.
Definitely.